Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm Lauren, and in my video this week I want to chat to you about buttonholes in the context of dressmaking and sewing your own clothes at home. And I know from talking to customers in my shop and teaching workshops over the past 6 years or so that buttonholes are quite a daunting thing for people. You know, it's like one of the last things that you do to your garments when you've put a lot of time and effort into them, and it's like one of the finishing touches, and the pressure is always quite high. But hopefully in this video I'm going to demystify a lot of those fears and just give you a bit more confidence in terms of trying it. So first of all, I just want to start right at the beginning, and I don't mean to sound like I'm being patronising or anything, but just so that we start right from the basics. So a buttonhole really is a hole in a fabric for a button to pass through. Now obviously if you've got a bit of fabric, you can't just cut a hole in it because the fabric will fray, won't it? It will rip and it will come apart. So in the context of dressmaking and buttonholes, and specifically stitched buttonholes, a buttonhole is actually a little section of quite dense stitching that is done in a particular shape, and then once that is done, a hole is then cut in the middle of that stitching for a button to pass through. So the fabric has to be stabilised and supported to make the hole for the button to pass through nice and robust and long lasting. So first of all, if we talk about stabilising it, now whenever you do buttonholes in a garment, you will have to have something that is on the back of the fabric to stabilise it and support it, because that very dense stitching that is done to form a buttonhole is quite heavy on the fabric, so there needs to be something else there for it to kind of hold on to, otherwise it'll just be too much for the fabric. So depending on the type of fabric that you're using to make your garment, you will have a certain weight of interfacing that gets bonded onto the back of the fabric. Now I have done a separate video that is just all about interfacing, so if you're still quite new to interfacings and kind of working out what ones you should use and everything, then you can check out that video. I'll put a link to it in the description, and I'll put a link that sort of pops up to that as well. And also the benefit of stabilising sections of your garment where buttonholes will be is that it just gives structure and form to the garment as well. So on a shirt, for example, the button placket that goes down the front, yes, you need the interfacing there to support the buttons, but it also gives form and structure to the garment because you need something that's a bit more sturdy over that button placket. A cuff, for example, you wouldn't want a kind of floppy, going all over the place cuff. The cuff has to be stabilised and supported because that's part of the design of the garment, and then it also has the benefit of supporting the buttonhole as well. So when you come to actually stitch your buttonholes onto your garment, that interfacing will already be in position. Now there is another thing that you can do to sort of stabilise and support buttonholes as well, and that is to use something called fray check. So this is like a little sort of mini bottle of glue, I guess it is, that's specific for fabric, and if you've got a fabric that is fraying quite a lot, then once you've sewn your buttonhole on and you've cut the hole in the middle, you can use this fray check just in that little centre bit of the hole just to kind of seal the edges and make it a bit stronger as well. You don't need to put too much on. It can dry quite firm if you put a lot on, so if you're ever not sure about doing it on a certain fabric, you can always test it and just leave it to dry on a little section before you put it on all your buttonholes. But that's just another additional thing that you can do to sort of stabilise and support the buttonholes and make them last a bit longer. So now I want to chat to you about buttonhole placement and orientation, because there's a few things that you would want to consider when it comes to actually deciding where you want your buttonholes to be. Now it's probably likely that with the pattern that you're making that has buttonholes, it will have specific markings on the paper pattern pieces that tell you where to put those buttonholes. Now they can be great as a guide, but from my experience, I usually always find that it's better to actually mark where you want the buttonholes to go once you've constructed the garment. Because as you're constructing it, there might be slight changes in where you've pressed something, or a seam allowance, or the length of something, or how you fitted it, and that can all change where you might want the buttons to be. So I guess what I'm saying really is don't be scared to sort of deviate from the pattern markings that are on the pattern, and that once you're actually at the stage of about to sew your buttonholes on, that you work out what is best for the garment and what's going to look right. Now, one consideration you'll have to make, which again the pattern may or may not tell you to do this, is the orientation of them in terms of horizontal or vertical. Now, what you have to think about when you put a buttonhole in is where in the garment is it and how much strain will actually be on it. So at the top of a collar, for example, or in a waistband of a pair of trousers or jeans or a skirt, the tendency will be, where it's something that's quite tightly fitted like that the garment will want to draw open in this direction. So your buttonhole has to be horizontal, and the button is actually going to move to that outside edge of the buttonhole, because there will be a tendency for the garment to sort of draw open and for there to be pressure in that sort of horizontal axis, so you orientate your button in that position. If the garment is a bit looser fitted, or if there's more buttons, so say down the front of a sort of looser dress or a shirt, for example, then it's more common that the buttons will sit vertically. If there's more buttons, then there's going to be less pressure on each individual buttonhole. And then also, if the garment's a bit looser, then the purpose of the buttonholes in that section are just to hold it closed. They're not going to be withstanding any pressure across your body like that. If it's something very fitted, like a very, very fitted bodice, then you would want them horizontal again, because the tendency will be to pull across. But if it's something looser or not as fitted, then vertical's absolutely fine. So your pattern may or may not tell you to do that, but you can start to think about these things and think about, what function is my buttonhole actually serving? What's it going to go through once I'm wearing this garment? And that can help to inform you as well as to what position you would want to sit it in. So when you come to actually sew the buttonhole onto your fabric, and if you're using your sewing machine to do that, depending on what type of sewing machine you've got, it's likely that there might be a few different options of shapes of buttonhole that you can use. Now, in my personal experience, for just making like normal, quite everyday clothes at home, I mainly use two different types of buttonhole. So I use the straight up kind of rectangular one, where it's just like a little rectangle of stitching, and then I also quite commonly use the one that is keyhole as well. So the keyhole one is good. It's got a rounded edge at one end. That is good if you're using buttons that have quite a thick shank on them. So for example, if you're making some jeans or a garment out of a thicker, heavier fabric, and the button that you're using's got a really thick shank, or jeans buttons typically got a thick shank on it, then the buttonhole needs to be able to sort of accommodate that. So that's why the keyhole is good for that. If it's on a blouse or a shirt, for example, and I've got buttonholes that are sitting more vertical, then it's likely that I will just do the straight up rectangular one. Now you can get another sort of basically like a rectangular one, but the edges are rounded a little bit. They're more for lighter weight fabrics. They just have a more delicate sort of feel to them. So if the fabric that you're using is very lightweight, then it might be that you want to use something like that, just because it aesthetically looks a little bit more delicate as well. Then you could get other keyhole ones that have different shapes at the end, so it might have a tapered shape edge. So from my experience, I would say those things are probably a bit more like a personal preference of how it looks. I tend to just use like the regular keyhole one that's just got like a bar tack at the bottom basically, or just like straight stitching. Sometimes machines will also have a buttonhole that's for stretch fabrics as well. So if you're putting a buttonhole in a stretch fabric, then the buttonhole is just sewn in a different way so that it can actually stretch with the fabric too. So the other thing that you want to consider when marking on your buttonholes is how far apart they actually are. And there's a few things that I think are worth thinking about that aren't necessarily just going off the button markings that may come with your pattern. So say for example you're making a shirt or a blouse, then what I normally do is just try it on, and I would mark where the fullest part of my bust is, and then I would know that I wanted a buttonhole there. If you somehow ended up with a button just slightly above and slightly below the fullest part of your bust, then it's likely that the blouse will end up sort of looking like it's kind of pulling open a little bit, so it's good to have one at the fullest part of your bust. The other consideration you might want to make as well is, are you going to wear this blouse or shirt open and not do it right up to the top collar? And if that's the case and you are going to wear it open, at what level do you want it to open at? And then have a think about where the button is going to be placed in relation to that, because if the button is really low and you want to wear it open, then you might feel like it's a bit too low, or that you then have to wear a top underneath it or something. So it's just another thing to think about before you actually put the buttonhole markings on. And so that would always sort of be like my starting point, where the fullest part of my bust is. Am I going to wear it open? Where do I want it to open to? And then I would decide between the very, very top edge of my collar and where that button is that I've decided I definitely want one there. How many buttons are going to fit in between there? Is it one? Is it two? And then you can use that spacing to mirror down the rest of the button placket. Sometimes the spacing in buttons can be like a design feature as well, so you might have before seen like two buttons quite close together and then a bit of a larger space in between, so you can sort of play around and decide what you like the look of the best. One tool that I find really useful when it comes to spacing out buttonholes is using the Simflex expanding sewing gauge. So as you expand this gauge out, the little markers that are on it then just get evenly spread out, and you can just lay that along the button placket of your garment and then mark where you want the buttonholes to be. It's also quite useful if you're not sure how many buttons to use, because you can quite quickly just readjust the gauge, lay the buttons out, see what it looks like with a certain number of buttons or a certain type of spacing. It helps you to visualize it a little bit better, and if you think that looks like too many buttons or it doesn't look like enough, then you can just retract or expand the gauge accordingly and then place the buttons on, and yeah, it just gives you a much quicker idea of what's actually going to look like once these buttonholes are on and the buttons are actually in place. Now, when you come to sew a buttonhole on your machine, it's likely that your machine will either have a one-step buttonhole function or a four-step buttonhole function. So if you imagine that rectangular stitching of the buttonhole, it's got four sides to it. So the machine will either do that in four individual steps, where you have to tell the machine what side of the buttonhole you want to stitch, and it will be more of a manual process because you'll have to alter the stitch selection and the dials on the machine to tell the machine what you actually want to do. Or in the context of a one-step buttonhole, this is a little bit more of a sophisticated machine that once you have programmed it and you have set it up, it will go round all four edges of that buttonhole in one step. It just does it automatically and you don't have to switch between stitches during it. You just set it all up, put your foot on the pedal and just let it go. So the two brother machines that I use at home, which is this one here, this is the Innovis VQ2, and then in the studio at the shop we have the brother NV1300s, but in terms of how the buttonhole is actually set up and how you work it is quite similar. So you need to get the buttonhole foot out of your machine, and then expand the top part of the buttonhole and place your button in that little section there. And what that does is it sets the distance between these 2 points on the left hand side of the foot, and that's what size the buttonhole will end up being. So obviously if you've got a bigger button, it's a much bigger buttonhole that gets stitched, smaller button, smaller buttonhole. So the machine's kind of calculating that for you already. So then you have to attach this onto the machine and take the normal foot off, and then there'll be a little buttonhole lever just at the side, and you have to pull that down and make sure that it is just sitting behind that first little sort of bit that kind of sticks up in the buttonhole foot. It has to be able to move between those 2 points. Then you have to select the buttonhole stitch that you'd like, and then you want to line up your fabric underneath the foot of the machine. So what I usually do is that, because with a one-step buttonhole the machine is just kind of going to go round it at a specified size that you've set the foot to, is that I only usually mark one end of the buttonhole. I don't actually draw a whole line out on the buttonhole. So I'll either do a chalk mark or put a little pin in the fabric, and then from that point, as you feed it into the machine, the machine will stitch the buttonhole sort of away from you in that direction. So using your little pin or chalk marker as a guide, you have to line that up in where the little red markings are on the foot of the machine, and then just lower the foot down and then just put your foot on the pedal, and the machine will automatically just stitch your buttonhole for you. So your hand should still be on the fabric as it's actually stitching, but purely as a guide. Don't sort of get in the way of what the machine's doing. It'll move the fabric forward and back a couple of times. You want to make sure that the fabric doesn't get stuck on the spot and start just sort of stitching in one place, because the thread all sort of gets gummed up. Once the machine's finished sewing the buttonhole, it will just automatically slow down on its own and stop, and then you can take it out and admire your buttonhole. Now, it's unlikely, I would say, that your machine will actually cut the hole in the fabric as well, so you have to do that yourself. And there's a couple of ways that you can do that. You could either use a little seam ripper. I'm sure everybody's got one of them. I would just put a pin at one end of the buttonhole just as a bit of a buffer, so that if you, in case you slip with the seam ripper, you're not actually ripping a much bigger hole in the fabric, and that can cut it open. Or you can get a little buttonhole cutter, which is basically like a little chisel, and you have to use that on a self-healing mat or something that's protecting your surface, and you just apply pressure through the handle of the little buttonhole cutter and press through the fabric, and that will open it up really nicely as well and just give a crisp finish. And then, as I was saying before, if you felt like your fabric was fraying a little bit, or you wanted to sort of make it a bit more robust, then you could cut some of the loose threads away and put a little bit of that fray check on it just at the end, just to sort of seal it all in and finish the buttonhole off. So I hope you found that useful. It's given you a bit more confidence in terms of using your sewing machine to sew buttons onto your fabric. If you fancy making a project that has got buttonholes in it, then in my shop we sell a lovely selection of lots of different types of patterns that have buttonholes as a feature in them, and I'll link to the blog post that goes with this video in the description of it, and you can see a list of lots of nice options there as well. If you've got any questions at all, please feel free to ask them in the comments, or if you want an answer a little bit quicker, then you can email the girls that work in my shop on info@guthrie-ganny.co.uk, and they can get back to you and try to help you out as well if you get stuck with anything. But thanks so much for watching, guys. If you haven't subscribed to my channel already, just remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss out on my next video, and I'll see you next time. Thanks, bye.